We searched long and hard and tried to find a stock YZ125 from last year to put up against this new one. It was hard to find one. Everybody we knew had one that was a big bore or was modded out or had the suspension built, but we finally got a stock YZ125 stock suspension and engine that was pretty close to stock and put them back to back. We have a full MXA tested video on the 2022 YZ125, the all new model that's got an updated engine, suspension, and all the goodies. We talk all about the details and really the inner workings of that bike in that video that was posted recently. In this versus video, we're going to strictly compare last year's and really the last 15 years of the YZ125 to the all new generation model that just came out. So going over some of the key differences between the new YZ125, obviously it's the cosmetics that are way different. This bike looks brand new, it's modern looking, much more exotic looking, and it actually looks a lot like the Fantic bikes that we see raced over at the EMX races over in Italy and in Europe. The YZ125 has been very popular. It first went from a steel frame to the aluminum frame that it has now way back in 2005, but we always talk about this bike's first year being in 2006 because that's when it got the famous KYB SSS forks, which are some of the best forks on the market, especially when you're talking about production forks that you can buy on a stock motorcycle. So since 2006, the YZ125 has been very, very similar, only received minor updates up until this 2022 model year where we basically got an all new bike. So a lot of people are questioning, is the YZ125 all new? On the outside, it does look kind of similar, especially when you're looking at the engine. Obviously the frame is the same, the swing arm is the same, but the bodywork, subframe, tank, those are all different. The engine, it looks very similar. It doesn't look like a crazy exotic engine that's upside down and completely new compared to last year's model, but internally and performance-wise, it has got a lot of upgrades and there's really not very many parts that cross over between the two. So we talk all about the details on the engine in our MXA tested video on the YZ125, but in this versus video, let's talk more about how they compare on the track. So starting off with the bodywork and the rider triangle. If you don't know what the rider triangle is, it's the measurements between the foot peg, the seat, and the handlebars. It's really your three contact points on the motorcycle. Immediately, when you get off the 2021 and get onto the 2022, you notice the difference on the track, in the pits, when you're sitting on the bike on its stand, it is completely different. So it's got a new subframe and a new seat now, and the seat's a lot more flat. So the bike feels like you're sitting on top of the bike rather than diving and sitting really into the bike. So the new seat is 6 millimeters taller at the middle of the seat, 5 millimeters shorter at the front of the seat, which makes it a lot more flat. Last year's YZ125 dips down a lot more, which makes you really sit into the bike, sit lower, and feel a little bit different on the track. So the new bodywork is slim, really comfortable. The seat is taller, and when you're on the track, you definitely feel it. Comparing it to KTM, Husqvarna, and last year's YZ125, those bikes squat down more, the seats are a little bit lower. This new seat on this YZ125 is definitely a lot taller, and for some riders, it was weird and tough to get used to. It felt like the seat was kind of kicking you in the butt as you were riding and as you were coming into corners. But once you get used to it, it becomes natural, and then it feels weird to go back to another bike or go back to last year's bike because it feels so much lower. So that is kind of a rider preference thing, but it's definitely taller. It's definitely different. So bodywork comparing them back to back, very, very different. And overall, it's a more of a racy feel where you're sitting on top of the bike, you're pushing the bike, and you're not really sagging down and getting that couch feel that you had on last year's bike. Next up, let's talk about the suspension. Comparing them from the 2021 to 2022, I learned today something new after a couple days of riding on the new bike, that the internals on the SSS forks on the new 2022 YZ125 are actually a little bit different. The forks and the shock are generally the same components, but the forks did get some updates from the internals that actually came off of the 4-stroke models with the KYB forks. So the suspension is different comparing them to the two, but you can slide your 2021 forks into the 2022. The triple clamps are the same, so you can slide your 2021 forks in and they'll fit right in on the 2022. But if you compare settings and internals on the forks, they are a little bit different and they are updated on the 2022 fork. So how the bikes feel on the track comparing last year and this year, it is a big difference when you talk suspension. So they went up on the spring rate, fork and shock. Both went up 1 spring rate. On the forks, they went up to a 4.2 from a 4.1 coil spring in the fork. So that brings up the spring rate, makes it hold up a little bit better. Better for faster riders and also better for heavier riders. And the shock, they also went up from a 46 shock spring to a 48 shock spring. So fork and shock have stiffer spring rates and they have stiffer valving, which is better for faster riders, better for heavier riders, better for guys that are racing, where last year's bike was really soft. And if you're a racer, pretty much had to take your suspension to a local tuner to get it stiffened up. All right, the next category I got to get into, comparing these two bikes back to back, is the engine. The engine is the #1 and most exciting aspect about the new YZ125 and the most interesting topic to talk about on this bike. The all-new 125 engine is really all new. Why? Well, the cylinder and the whole thing is tilted forward 4 degrees, and that allows more air to come in through the airbox and through the intake. The subframe that this new bike has allows more air to get into that airbox. The air filter has less wings on it, so more air flowing into the engine. As mentioned, the whole engine is tilted forward to get more air in, get more of a downdraft and kind of a straighter intake to get more air into the airbox. The cylinder's been updated, the transmission has been updated, the crank, everything inside of the piston's been updated. A lot of different updates that we go more in detailed with on our tested video about this bike. A lot of updates on the YZ125 engine, and as I mentioned, it doesn't look very different on the outside. If you walk up to it and you look at it from the side, it's okay, yeah, it looks, maybe they changed a few different things, but if you put them side by side, that's when you really notice the differences that Yamaha made to the 2022, and when you really look at what they did inside on the intake ports, exhaust ports, piston, combustion chamber, all of it's been changed and upgraded to make the new YZ125 a lot faster. So how did it perform on the track? Well, that's the big question. The new YZ125, I can confidently say, rides like a mod YZ125 from last year. How so? Well, the 2021 YZ125 engine has been the same for years and years. That thing was refined, it was smooth, it was easy to ride. MXA Wrecking Crew, we always said that the YZ125 was the easiest bike to ride, but the KTM was the best bike to race. The KTM was better to race because it had a harder hitting power band that pulled longer and stronger on the top end, which really helped you pull down straightaways, up hills, over jumps and stuff like that. Where the YZ125 was easier to ride, better for beginner and novice riders, and really a more fun bike to play on because you didn't have to clutch it coming out of every corner. As soon as you cracked the throttle, it ran into the RPMs quickly, smoothly, and easily, making it a great YZ125, a great transition bike from 85 to big bikes. Just in its stock form, stock jetting, stock gearing, stock pipe and silencer, it was easy to ride the YZ125, where with KTM, you might have to do a little bit of tuning with the power valve. You might have to mess with the sprocket a little bit more to get it to be that easy off the crack of the throttle, really, which is tough for guys that are either transitioning from a 4-stroke and they're lazier, they're not as experienced as riding with the power band of a 2-stroke. The YZ125 was simple and easy to ride. So the new engine for YZ125, like I said, is like a mod bike. So how mod bikes work, last year when you modded the YZ125, it takes away from that initial easy to ride, crack of the throttle, bottom end, adds a lot more in the mid-range and the high RPM power. And that's what this new YZ125 is all about. It's not as impressive as I thought it would be off the bottom end. It wasn't as easy to just come out of a corner, roll into the throttle as it was last year, but it's a lot stronger in the mid-range and a lot stronger high in the RPMs. Comparing the 2021 YZ125 versus the 2022 on the dyno, the new model, it feels exactly like on the track as what it shows us on the dyno, so that's always a confirming feeling when the dyno numbers match up with what you're thinking it feels like on the track. The new bike isn't as strong off the crack of the throttle, it's actually slower up until 7,500 RPM, but that's when it starts to pick up the pace and beat out last year's bike. The new bike is stronger in the mid-range and the high RPM range by a horsepower more, but it is still slower than the KTM and Husky models, and it does have more foot-pounds of torque, about a half a foot-pound of torque more on the new bike. So really breaking down the 2021 versus 2022, I would say the 2022 is much more tailored to pro riders, much more tailored to experienced racers and guys who are looking to battle against the KTMs, where the last year's YZ125 and the years prior were better for the average rider and somebody who's really just getting on a two-stroke for the first time or just wanting a bike that's easier to ride. Another big change that affects the power is that the carburetor's been updated on the YZ125 as well. So it went from a 38mm Mikuni TMX carburetor to a Kian PWK 38S. So a Kian carburetor is something that coming on the YZ250 since 2001. So Yamaha has experience with this bike and with this carburetor running on these two strokes, and now they've brought this Kian carburetor onto the YZ125. More on the carburetor, we did have to mess with the jetting to really dial it in for our riders these last few days here testing. One cool thing, Yamaha does give you different needles, pilot jets, main jets with your new YZ125. So if you buy the 2022, make sure to keep that owner's manual and look in there for a little plastic baggie that's gonna have your jets in there. It comes with the NYDF needle in it. We put a leaner needle in there that Yamaha provides, and we put it on the stock position. We also ran a different pilot jet. Yamaha comes with a 75 stock in the pilot jet. We ran a 72. The air screw, we backed it out to 3.5 turns out, and the main jet, we went from a 160 to a 162, and we also upped the idle a little bit too to help it get out the crack of the throttle. So we did make some changes to the YZ125 for 2022, and that's one thing I will tell you, if you're debating on last year's bike or this year's bike, the new one, because it is a first year model, it's gonna take a little more time to perfect the jetting. At least that's our experience so far, and we're still working with it. The final opinion and final review of this video, the all new YZ125 versus the tried and true one that's been around for years and years. The new YZ125 is a better race bike than it was before. It's built to race against the KTM. Is it a KTM killer? Well, you'll have to see our other videos for that as we compare it with the Husky TC125 that we've been testing with it as well. So be sure to keep your eyes peeled out for that video. The bike is definitely a more race-ready bike. The engine is stronger in the mid-range and the high RPM range. Stiffer suspension, so it holds up better. Better to go racing on the 2022 than it is on the 2021 is a big improvement. And really, the moral of the story is that I'm thankful that Yamaha is continuing to put money into their two-stroke line. This is something that we never expected. A new YZ125, while Honda, Kawasaki, and Suzuki have ditched two strokes and left them in the dust, Yamaha, KTM, Husqvarna, and Gas are still producing them and still making them better, and that's something we really appreciate. So. As always, motocrossactionmag.com for all of our content, videos, shootouts, bike tests, product tests, race results, and more. And if you haven't seen our full MXA tested video on the YZ125, where we talk more in depth about the changes that were made on that bike, check it out on our website or YouTube channel. 2022 YZ125 versus 2022 Husky 125. That video is going to be on our YouTube and website as well.